Welcome to Connected Classrooms, which is a part of the B Street SMART program. Today we'll be talking about the reality of crashes, which is really about learning to live the rest of your life with a brain injury. My name is Margaret Doyle and I work at the Westmead Brain Injury Rehabilitation Service as a case manager. I'm part of a community education team there, and we're going to be hearing from two speakers today, and that will be Qayyum Abdul and Paul Shepherd. But before we hear their real life stories, I'm going to share a little with you about how the brain works and how the brain can be injured. There's a bit of jargon in the world of brain injury rehab, like most areas, and I just wanted to clear up a few things. If you say that you've had a head injury, that's any injury to the head. It's a very non-specific term, and it may in fact just mean that you've got a bruise or a cut on your scalp or somewhere on your face. But an injury to the head can be a lot more serious than that. We sometimes refer to the term acquired brain injury. Now, an acquired brain injury relates to any brain injury that you get after birth. So it may be a brain impairment which is due to a tumour, or it might be relating to some kind of bleed inside the brain, something that's a medical cause. And the most common cause of acquired brain injury is stroke. Stroke usually causes quite specific and unilateral damage to the brain. However, what we're talking about mostly today is traumatic brain injury. That's a brain injury that occurs as a result of an accident, of a trauma to the brain. Now, 70% of all traumatic brain injuries are caused by road accidents. And falls and assaults are the next most common cause. So if we were to look at the causes of impairment to the brain, there'd be a number of things that we'd be talking about. Clearly accidents, but also things like stroke, tumours, diseases like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, infections like meningitis, a lack of oxygen, which is something that happens if you're electrocuted, for example, or if you have a drug overdose, and poisons and toxins themselves will also impair the brain, and probably the biggest one of those is alcohol. But what you need to understand about the brain for today's presentation is that the brain is actually a very soft organ. It's about the consistency of margarine or butter. So it's that soft, you could stick your finger right into it. Or, as we sometimes say, you could eat it with a spoon. The brain is actually encased inside the skull for protection. And that hard protective case has a design fault. It's not smooth on the inside like an eggshell. It's got lots of hard, sharp, irregular, bony ridges. Now, the brain itself is also floating in fluid which cushions and protects it. But when the physics of motion comes into play, that skull is no longer a protective mechanism, it can be a liability. Because if you're travelling at a certain speed and you stop suddenly, your brain is going to continue to travel at that speed until it too stops suddenly. And we have margarine consistency brain smashing up against all the hard, sharp, irregular bony ridges inside of your skull. It's how the majority of brain injuries occur. They're what we call closed head injury. So there may be no external sign of injury, not even any fractures to the skull. But inside the skull, your brain in fact may be bruised, torn, bleeding, swelling. Now we know that the brain is composed of millions and millions of nerve cells, and those nerve cells don't really regenerate. There are connections between those cells which send messages throughout the brain and down through your spinal column in order to make every function of your body work. It's very much like a computer. I mentioned earlier about the idea of a focal injury that you have after a stroke, and you can also have a focal injury in an accident, particularly in assault, for example, if you're stabbed or shot in the head. That very specific sort of injury is something that causes very specific types of deficits and disabilities. But what we more commonly see in road trauma is what we call diffuse injury. And that is an injury that's caused by the brain being shaken inside the skull. Diffuse injuries are really very much more complicated to diagnose and to manage because it might be at a microscopic level, something that doesn't even show up on a CT scan. But inside the brain, in terms of its function, you can have impairment. Something that's really important for you to know is that every person who has a brain injury is different, and they're going to have a very different experience of brain injury, as different as each of you are. And then the accident that you have may have very different sort of impacts as well. But having said that, brain injury doesn't decrease your intelligence or really your life expectancy much. So survive a brain injury and you'll probably be living with the consequences of it for a long time. So when somebody does have a traumatic brain injury, what actually happens? Usually you lose consciousness for a time. You may be, when you wake up again, very drowsy or confused, often a bit irritable or agitated. Depending on the severity of that injury, you might then need to be transferred to a hospital where sometimes you may be put into an induced coma to manage your injuries. Because brain injuries often don't happen in isolation, particularly in road traumas. There's frequently other very serious life-threatening injuries that occur at the same time. In the world of brain injury, we say that the deficits you have at 2 years post your injury are likely to be with you permanently. However, that doesn't mean that those deficits and disabilities can't be ameliorated or improved through rehabilitation. And the main reason why we come and speak to students of your age as part of our community education program is that brain injury occurs more often to young people. Statistically, you're at a much greater risk of sustaining brain injury than other age groups. And that's a statistic that we would really like to change. The Think Twice program's been running for 13 years, and we talk to high school and tertiary students about the brain and about real life stories. This is something that we've been doing through the B Street program and through the connected classrooms in recent times. So these individuals that share their stories of brain injury recovery are a great inspiration to me in my work. And today, as I said, we'll be hearing from 2 speakers, and we're now ready to hear from the first. So our first speaker today will be Qayyum Abdul. So please join me in welcoming Qayyum.